US climate goals in the next decade, only about 12% of that is flowing. And of that 12%, less than 15% comes from the private sector. And that is compared to over 70% in developed economies. That's not right, and that can't stand. But we also know that countries lose between 5 and 15% of GDP. 5 and 15% of GDP due to the impacts of climate and their negative impacts on communities. So it sounds like we should be depressed. I don't want to depress you, and in fact, the fortunate thing about this incredibly inspiring panel is that we can shift into an opportunity mode and hold that challenge of not having an opportunity cost of delayed action, but of moving faster. We are in this beautiful continent with 60% of the world's solar resources, 70% of the world's cobalt, the highest proportion of young people under 30 in the world, 5% of global lithium resources, and enough green hydrogen potential to produce 50 million tons a year and unlock $1 trillion of investment. Africa, as we know, has forests that remove more carbon than the Amazon, lands and oceans that produce food for the world. And with the majority of the talent in this room and on this panel, I'm certain we can shift to an opportunity framing. I'm certain that we can talk about the potential. I'm certain we can talk about action. And with that, it is my absolute privilege to invite Minister Creasy to share some reflections. I know that you have been involved in the global stocktake, and it would be wonderful to hear what are people saying, what are they asking for when we look at where we're at and where we need to go and how we finance it.
Good morning to everybody, and allow me to congratulate our hosts for the warm reception we have received and for finally bringing about Africa's first climate summit. I suppose that the reason that we have to talk about the past is that it helps us to better understand where we are today. And as you've correctly pointed out, action with regard to climate finance has been delayed. We're still waiting for the 100 billion. We have had a commitment for the doubling of adaptation finance, but as yet, I'm sometimes tempted to say doubling nothing is still nothing. So what's the problem on the table? The problem on the table is we have this enormous opportunity, but the African continent is unable to realize the opportunity because the major form of finance we need is in the adaptation area, and it's specifically in the area of infrastructure. Without infrastructure, it becomes enormously difficult to exploit the vast resources that exist on our country. And so because we haven't received the mitigation financing, and we're yet to see the adaptation financing, we are unfortunately pushed into the loss and damage area. And you would all know that last year, ahead of the UNFCCC meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, there was significant research done. That particular piece of research, which is known as the Stern-Songwe High-Level Expert Panel Report, indicated that by 2030, we could be looking at something like 300 billion in loss and damage. So how do we move from there? Well, of course, the first issue is that we need to see significant and new grant financing, because it's only through this grant financing that we will begin to unlock private financing that could exist for investment. Why is that? Well, first of all, you've already heard that most of African countries, including ourselves, are no longer at investment grade. So the cost of borrowing in an already heavily indebted nation like South Africa is exorbitant, and we unfortunately are not in a position to do it. So what it means is that we need a new suite of financial instruments, instruments that would first of all allow us to deal with debt, the debt burden in our societies, and secondly, instruments that would allow us to start to scale up the investments that you've talked about. What's the problem there? The fundamental problem is who is going to finance the first loss. If we're going to start to invest in technologies that as yet have not been realized, like green hydrogen, where is the financing for first loss going to come from? We do have, as we heard from President Ruto, enormous potential in terms of our carbon sinks, but natural capital accounting is still a new science, and payment for ecosystem services is still something that is not globally accepted as a revenue source. So these are possible new areas of finance, and I suppose today what we've got to discuss is whether we have the appetite for the reform of the MDBs, whether we have the appetite to address the real indebted situation that Africa is in, and how through really addressing that situation we can start to attend to the important opportunities that exist. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you so much, and for your leadership constantly of calling out fit for purpose climate finance, especially around the debt agenda. Just before I move to Minister Jørgensen, are you hopeful that there is that ambition for reform?
Well, we all live in hope. It's what keeps us going, isn't it?
Minister Jørgensen, are you hopeful? You obviously have a huge responsibility sitting here as the donor voice, and an interesting lesson from Denmark about transition. Are you hopeful?
I am hopeful, but I'm primarily hopeful because I've decided to be so. Because if we look at the actual numbers and we look at the speed of which things are moving forward, unfortunately there's a lot of things that needs to be improved, and it's going too slow. So why am I choosing to be hopeful? Well, I think if decision makers don't choose to be hopeful and don't choose to have visions, then there's no way of us reaching these targets. I like to use the example also that if we look at the civil rights movement in the United States of America, Martin Luther King, he did not start a revolution by giving a speech called "I have a nightmare," right? Similarly, we need to focus on the positive aspects. Now, having said that, I will start with a somewhat bleak analysis. Looking at what's been possible to mobilize and finance the last decade, we are so far from where we need to be. Going back to 2009 at COP15 in Copenhagen, my own country, it was decided that from 2020 to 2025, we needed to mobilize 100 billion a year in climate financing. Now, hopefully we will reach that target this year, but that's 3 years too late. And fact of the matter is that even if we manage that, we're talking 100 billion. And we know for a fact that we need trillions. For Africa alone, we need probably around 250 billion a year. So we need to do something fundamentally different. Most obvious point that Barbara also made was that we need more public grants from developed countries. I mean, the United Nations recommends 0.7% in development aid every year. And my own country, Denmark, has been allocating that for more than 40 years now, so we would definitely also urge other countries to follow that. But we also need to look at how that money is then spent. And I think there's big potential for spending the money wiser. First of all, we need to recognize that development fight against poverty, fight against hunger, fight for education, fight for economic growth. All of these things are today interlinked with the climate agenda. So this means that we also need to align our spending of development aid with this. So that's my first point. My second point here is public money and public grants are also very well used as a de-risker of investment. So as the President alluded to earlier in his excellent speech, it is actually a paradox that there's a lot of money out there, billions and billions from institutional investors that wanting to be invested in green purposes. So why doesn't it happen? Well, one of the reasons is that the risks are often too big. So maybe if we spend our public money de-risking the investments of the private sector, that can open up for a big influx of needed capital. I do have some good news for you today, if that's okay, because we have just in Denmark put forward the government our proposal for next year's fiscal law, so our budget for the next year, and in that we have put forward a suggestion, a proposal to double our funding of the Global Green Climate Fund. We think that that's an extremely important fund. Thank you. The GCF is doing a great job, both with regards to adaptation and mitigation, and we would urge others to follow that example. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minister, and congratulations. We hope other countries follow that example. And now, forgive me for being a bit controversial, but sometimes I can sit on these panels and think, I agree. Let's use public capital to de-risk private investments. And then I look at the numbers, and we've run them, and I see that less than $1 of private capital is mobilized for every public dollar of MDB climate finance. Less than 1 to 1. I look at people like Razan in the audience from the Open Society Foundations, and I see her skeptically looking at me, saying, ask the panel what it means. Tell me what instruments actually do this. And so Mimi has the challenge here of giving us some answers. I know you've got some examples of where this public capital can actually work to de-risk. And Mimi, over to you.
Sure, thank you, Catherine. It's great to be here with everyone. And I'm so glad that Alain from Africa 50 kind of set the stage appropriately about blended instruments. But maybe, to give an example from sort of my development finance institution days, when I was at OPIC, which is now called the U.S. Development Finance Institution, we had a lot of sort of pressure to do more for climate, particularly in clean energy in developing countries. But the toolkit of the institution just didn't allow it to invest in early stage, which is often the most catalytic, the most important. The minister from South Africa mentioned that as well. So we got a $20 million grant facility to do just that. And believe it or not, that $20 million ended up mobilizing about $1 billion in a blended way, because it was sort of the right instrument. 20 million in equity grant facility. Literally, we developed the first utility scale solar in Rwanda, projects in West Africa. It was nimble, it was fast, but that dried up. When that facility dried up, basically they couldn't do that anymore. And I think what we need to do more is institutionalize that. How do you, not just institutionalize it, but how do you embed that in the private sector so that when a new administration or government changes, those things don't end? I think we might just say, I think it's clear that early stage, risk tolerant, nimble, committed capital to develop and build projects at scale is what we really need at this moment. The private sector sort of typically, as a mandate, thinks about sort of maximizing your returns, minimizing your risks, right? And when you think about it more in the context of, Africa, unfortunately, a few of the speakers today have already talked about that. It's quite exaggerated. There are real risks. And when you're thinking about new technologies in climate, in emerging markets, in Africa, it usually limits the private sector's role to participate. So to literally answer your question in a nutshell, I think what's really missing is enough risk-tolerant capital going to back projects at the very early stage. What you're seeing, I think, in Kenya, Nigeria, in the fintech sector, right, where you have a lot of investors coming in at the early stage, we need that for climate, but at a much, much more accelerated levels. Where, if I could be simple, if a total project cost is $100, is that really initial $5 coming in at the right time that really unlocks that 95? And that's what we need more of.
Mimi, thank you for being so specific. And if you will allow me, Minister Jurgensen, it sounds like there are countries